Welcome to another deep dive brought to you by the OtisWho network. And today, we're diving into the world of influencer culture.
Okay.
Specifically, a pretty shocking story involving an influencer who called herself the new trophy wife. It's not just your typical influencer drama, though, right?
Right.
This really raises questions about the messages we're seeing online and the values that they're promoting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important conversation to have.
Now, we have two main sources that we'll be looking at today. The first is a video essay by YouTuber ChishiZ, who does a great job of analyzing the situation.
Yeah, he's great.
And then we also have some audio clips from another influencer, Sheer7, who actually promotes this trophy wife lifestyle.
Interesting.
So to give everyone some background, the new trophy wife basically built her online persona around this image of a perfect life.
Right. The wealthy husband, the luxury vacations, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, exactly. But behind all the curated social media posts, there was a horrifying reality.
Yeah.
It eventually came out that her husband had been inappropriate with her two young daughters, aged 2 and 4.
Really awful situation. And it makes you think about the potential dangers of striving for this idealized image that might not align with reality at all.
For sure.
Yeah.
And to make things even more complicated, the new trophy wife has openly said that Sheer7 was a huge inspiration to her. She even has a quote where she says, "I happened to come across Sheer7 on YouTube, and she completely changed my life. She basically taught me what a high-value man is."
Wow. So she was really taking this advice to heart. It wasn't just entertainment for her. This was like a guidebook for how to live her life.
It seems that way, right?
Yeah.
How did Sheer7 respond to all of this? Her name's being dragged into this pretty serious situation.
Well, she released a video distancing herself from what happened, claiming that anyone who made bad choices like the new trophy wife wasn't really following her message.
So she's essentially saying, if you make bad choices, don't blame me.
Yeah, she's putting the responsibility back on the followers, saying that her true followers wouldn't end up in these situations.
Interesting. It's definitely a way of deflecting responsibility.
Hmm.
It does bring up an interesting question, though. Is it really possible for an influencer to completely separate themselves from the potential consequences of their message? Especially when their followers are taking it so literally? We just heard the new trophy wife talking about how much Sheer7 impacted her.
It's a complex question for sure, and it's something that ChishiZ actually tackles head-on in his video essay. While he doesn't believe Sheer7 is directly responsible for what happened to the new trophy wife, he does argue that her teachings about prioritizing a man's money above all else can create a slippery slope.
Okay, so he's saying that while she didn't explicitly tell the new trophy wife to make these choices, her message definitely provided a framework that could lead someone down that path.
Right, and it's interesting because he also compares Sheer7 to the late influencer Kevin Samuels.
Oh yeah, I remember him. He was pretty controversial.
He was. But on the surface, they seem kind of similar, right? Because they both gave advice on high-value relationships.
I see what you mean. But ChishiZ points out there were some key differences in their approaches and their ultimate goals.
Exactly. Kevin Samuels, controversial as he was, really focused on self-improvement and accountability. For both men and women, he wanted his followers to become better versions of themselves.
And Sheer7 is more about using men's wealth to your advantage.
Right. She really emphasizes personal gain for women, often through tactics that could be considered manipulative.
Wow, it's so interesting how two people can use the same language,
Yeah.
like high-value relationships, but have completely different intentions. And I bet that seemingly small difference can lead to very different outcomes for their audiences.
It absolutely can. And what I find particularly concerning about this high-value man narrative is that it can lead people to overlook really crucial elements of a healthy relationship.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, they might find themselves chasing after wealth and status without considering factors like shared values, emotional maturity, even basic respect.
Right. It's all about what someone has instead of who they are as a person.
Yeah, exactly. And when those core values are missing, it's just a recipe for trouble.
And this is where ChishiZ's argument about the need for guidance becomes so important. He talks about how crucial it is to have strong parental figures or mentors, especially for young women who are bombarded by these messages online.
I think that's so important, especially in today's world.
It makes you wonder, are we doing enough as a society to equip young people with the critical thinking skills they need to navigate this crazy digital world? Are we teaching them to question the messages they encounter and think for themselves?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think it's one we need to be grappling with more and more as influencer culture continues to grow.
Well, we are going to be grappling with it right after this break. So stick with us. We'll be back in a minute to dig deeper into this whole idea of guidance and what it really means to develop those critical thinking skills.
Sounds good. And that brings us back to Chinchi Zed's argument about guidance. He specifically mentions the importance of parental figures in helping young people navigate these tricky waters. Do you think that's putting too much responsibility on parents? Especially in a world where kids are often exposed to content online that parents may not even be aware of.
That's a really good point. I think it's important to broaden the definition of guidance beyond just the parents. It can also include teachers, mentors, older siblings, even friends. It's about having people you trust who can offer different perspectives and help you think critically about the messages you're encountering. Because, let's face it, trying to shield young people from all potentially harmful content online is probably an impossible task.
Yeah, it is. It's more realistic and probably more effective to equip them with the tools to critically analyze the content they do encounter, to help them understand that not everything they see online is true, healthy, or even realistic.
So if we're talking about equipping young people with these critical thinking skills, where do we even start? I mean, how do you teach someone to question everything they see and hear, especially when it comes from sources they admire or look up to?
Well, I think education plays a huge role. We need to be teaching media literacy in schools starting at a young age. Kids need to learn how to evaluate sources, identify bias, and understand how algorithms shape the content they see. Think of it like learning a new language. Once you understand the grammar and the vocabulary, you can start to deconstruct how sentences are put together and even identify when someone is trying to manipulate you with their words.
That's a great analogy. So it's not just about teaching kids to be skeptical of everything they see online. It's about giving them the tools to understand how online content is created, who's creating it, and what their motivations might be.
Exactly. And it's about helping them develop a sense of agency so they don't feel like they're just passively consuming whatever is being fed to them. Because at the end of the day, critical thinking is about making informed choices that align with your own values.
So let's apply that to this case. If we were to look at Sheer 7's content with a critical eye, what might some red flags be? What are some of the things that might make someone stop and say, wait a minute, is this really advice I should be following?
Well, one red flag is the emphasis on a partner's wealth as the primary marker of a high-value relationship. This sets up a potentially dangerous dynamic where material wealth is prioritized over things like shared values, emotional maturity, and even basic respect. It can also create a transactional view of relationships, which is rarely healthy or sustainable.
It also sets people up for a potentially skewed definition of happiness. If you're constantly chasing after material wealth, you might miss out on the things that truly bring joy and fulfillment, like genuine connection, personal growth, and contributing to something larger than yourself.
Exactly. It's like building your entire sense of self-worth on a foundation of external validation. It's a recipe for disappointment because those external factors are constantly changing and ultimately out of your control.
And that brings us back to one of Chinchi Zed's key points, the need for strong inner values and a sense of self-worth that isn't dependent on external factors like wealth or status.
Yes, because when your sense of worth comes from within, you're less likely to be swayed by these types of messages that promote a materialistic and often unrealistic view of happiness.
So what I'm hearing is that critical thinking isn't just about being skeptical of everything you see online. It's about developing a strong internal compass that helps you navigate the complexities of the world, both online and offline.
It is. It's about asking yourself, what do I believe? What are my values? And then using those values as a filter to evaluate the information you encounter and the choices you make.
This is such a rich conversation, and I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but unfortunately we're running out of time. Before we wrap up, are there any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the main takeaway is that we all have a responsibility to be critical thinkers, not just for our own well-being, but for the health of our society as a whole. Because when we blindly follow the loudest voices or the most appealing messages without questioning them, we give away our power and become vulnerable to manipulation.
That's such a powerful reminder. We have a choice in how we consume information and what we allow to influence us. And the more we practice those critical thinking skills, the more equipped we'll be to make informed decisions that lead to a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Well said.
So with that in mind, let's wrap up this deep dive into the world of influencer culture and the importance of critical thinking. A huge thank you to the OtisWho Network for making this episode possible.
It's been a pleasure being here.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.